All right, today's readings from Habakkuk chapter 2. We'll start with verse 2, and that's on page 737 in the Pew Bibles. Okay, and it says, "And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects all his own, all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, for how long, and loads himself with pledges? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city in iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea."
Yeah, you can take a seat. So I hope you all had a happy 4th of July this past week. Of course, 4th of July is a time to reflect on our country, reflect on what it means to be an American, to reflect on what are some of the qualities or characteristics that we as Americans tend to embody. And I would suggest that one quality that I think is representative of Americans is that we do not like to wait. Right? We don't like to wait. I mean, fast food and TV dinners, if I'm not wrong about this, were invented in America, right? We would rather have an average meal now than have to wait for a better meal. You know, the truth is that when you think about technology and this technological age that we are in, one way of understanding what the goal of technology is it's just to enable us to not have to wait as often, right? I mean, transportation, the sort of revolutions that have taken place throughout history, going from the horse to the car to the plane, it's all there so that when you're traveling from point A to point B, you don't have to wait as long. And then you think about the internet and you know, every however many months it is, we go from 1G to 2G to 3G to I don't even know how many Gs we are at this point. Do you all remember this? Do you remember when you would go to download your favorite song off of Napster? Good, you all didn't do that. That's good to hear. And it would take like 3 hours for the song to be downloaded, right? Yeah. We don't want to wait that long. We want it instantly. Do you remember when you would watch your favorite TV show and then you'd have to wait, right, for the next episode? I remember watching MacGyver, I think it was, and I'm watching MacGyver and it gets to this really intense moment in the story, like a bomb is about to go off and to be continued. And then you have to wait a week to find out what happens with this bomb. Well, you don't have to anymore, right? You just download the next episode. We as Americans do not like to wait. Today we're continuing in our series on the minor prophets, a series called Who You Callin' Short. And of course, what we've seen is that the minor prophets are a collection of of books in the Old Testament that are often overlooked. They're overlooked for a number of reasons. One is that they comprise the final 12 books of the Old Testament, so many of us don't get that far in our reading of the Old Testament. They are also overlooked because they are comparatively short, and so we just kind of skip over them. But what we've seen throughout this series is that they're not overlooked by everybody, actually. In fact, what we have discovered is that they tend to be overlooked primarily by the powerful and the privileged. That the powerless and the underprivileged are often the ones who give voice to the prophets. We saw this a number of weeks ago with the I Have a Dream speech, this famous American speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And what does he do? He quotes from the minor prophets. He quotes from the book of Amos. And so we see that the prophets are a voice for those who are powerless or underprivileged, whereas maybe they are overlooked by those who are powerful and privileged. Right? Because, again, what is the reason for this? Why is it that they would be overlooked by some and then championed by others? And what we see is that one of the major themes of the prophets in general and also of the minor prophets is the theme of justice. That the prophets are crying out for justice. They see injustice in their world. They see the weak being trampled on by the strong in all of the different ways in which that manifests itself. In fact, that's what the prophets see is the problem when they go to enforce the law, right? We've seen that they are the covenant enforcers. That's really what they are. They're there to enforce the covenant that was made between God and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai through Moses. The 10 Commandments, of course, are sort of at the very heart of this covenant. And what the prophets came to see is that what the 10 Commandments are pointing towards is a society that is just. That the 10 Commandments and the law itself is not just a code for personal morality. It certainly is that, but it's much bigger. It points to a society that is just. And so we find over and over again the prophets harping on the injustice that is present in their society and longing for justice. And we see the same theme in the book of Habakkuk. Now, let me just sort of set the context here, the background here. Habakkuk lived in the turbulent times of the late 7th century BC. Now, right before the time of Habakkuk, or at least right before the time in which this prophecy comes to us, was actually a season of relative prosperity. It was actually a season when the people of God actually turned back to God. It was a season under the reign of one of the greatest kings in Israelite history, and that was the reign of Josiah. Right, when you look at the kings throughout both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, there were 42 kings in total, and only 2 kings got a really good evaluation from God. Only 2 out of the 40. One of them was Hezekiah, and the other one was Josiah. Josiah was one of the rare cases of a person in power with privilege who used that power to try to bring justice and to try to bring the people of God back to obedience to the covenant. He seems like he's one of the few that actually listened to the prophets. In a few weeks, we'll look at the prophet Zephaniah, and it seems that maybe Josiah actually listened to Zephaniah. And so he tried to call the people back to the law, back to the 10 Commandments, back to the covenant, the commitment they had made. Unfortunately, Josiah was then killed in battle with the Egyptians. And then when he went down, when he was gone, there was a leadership struggle. The Egyptians actually kind of brought in a puppet king, somebody who would do whatever they wanted him to do. And it ended up leading back to sort of chaos within Judah, and it led back to a season of injustice and people taking advantage of others and not looking out for one another. And so Habakkuk is crying out against this return of injustice, but we see the context, perhaps the context helps to explain why when Habakkuk cries out about injustice, he does it a little bit differently than what we've seen with some of the other prophets. Because with some of the other prophets, what we've primarily seen is them accusing the people of Israel for failing to stick to the commandments. They point the finger, whether it's Amos or Micah, whoever it is, they're pointing the finger at the people of Israel for failing to live up to the covenant. But what we find here in Habakkuk, actually, is he's pointing the finger at God. What seems to be the case is he's looking around and he's seeing this return of injustice in his society. And what he realizes is that things were going well when Josiah was king. This is conjecture. We don't know exactly if this is what he's thinking, but it makes sense, right? You can kind of hear in him the sense of, God, why didn't you protect Josiah? Why did you allow him to be taken from us? Why did you allow leadership to once again disrupted and then that lead to injustice? And you don't seem to care about it, right? So he's pointing the finger at God, and this is what emerges at the beginning of the book. So I'm going to go back here to the very beginning of the book, chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, and this is what we see. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So the book begins with this accusation towards God, complaining to God about the injustice in society. And so this complaint then begins what proves to be a dialogue between Habakkuk and God, which is basically what the book of Habakkuk is. It's a dialogue going back and forth between Habakkuk and God, and then it finally ends in a prayer. So we get this complaint, and then in the next section, we get God's response. Listen to how God responds to Habakkuk's complaint. It says, "Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God." What he's saying here is he's saying, listen, Habakkuk, I'm going to deal with the injustice that is going on in Judah. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, which is another way of talking about the Babylonians. So Chaldeans, Babylonians, same thing. So Chaldeans was a region in Babylon. So he's saying, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, and I'm going to bring them in as an instrument of judgment against those who are causing violence and injustice in Israel. I'm going to judge the nation of Judah because they have forfeited the covenant, and the way I'm going to judge them is by bringing in the Babylonians to conquer them. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because precisely the same thing happened to the northern kingdom 100 years earlier. It's the same story, different characters. If you remember when we were looking at the prophets of Amos and Hosea and whatnot, we see that the northern kingdom of Israel, they also were living very unjustly. And so similarly, God raised up the Assyrian nation as an instrument of judgment against the northern kingdom. So now he's saying, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use the Babylonians to bring judgment on the southern kingdom. Now, just a superficial reading of the way God explains what's going to happen with the Chaldeans raises some questions. And you could see that Habakkuk now, he's got some questions about this. And what I want to suggest here is that really the next part, so Habakkuk is going to respond to what God says. And what I want to suggest that Habakkuk is basically saying is this. Really? That's your plan? Sending in the Chaldeans? How is that good news? I would suggest that's more or less what he's saying in this next section, which we'll now read. This is verses 12 through 2:1. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning his complaint. So again, Habakkuk is saying, wait, you're going to send in the Babylonians to deal with injustice in our society? Really, God? That is your solution? As I mentioned, the Babylonians, they're kind of the heirs to the Assyrian nation. We saw a couple weeks ago, I guess, the Assyrians, they would come in and they were brutal. They were ruthless. And the Babylonians, it's kind of like when they came to power, they wanted to try to be like the Assyrians, wanted to try to follow in their example. For example, we see here that the Babylonians incorporated a policy that the Assyrians had, and that is that they deported people. When they would come in, they would conquer a nation, and they would deport thousands of them and kind of resettle them throughout their land. We saw the Assyrians did this with the northern kingdom. Well, now the Babylonians do the same thing. They come in to Judah, and they deport a bunch of people, resettle them throughout the Babylonian Empire. That seems to be probably what Habakkuk is alluding to when he uses this whole imagery of how we are fish in the sea, and how the fisherman comes and drags them up in his nets. That's the Babylonians. That's his way of saying they're going to come and put us in their nets, and they're going to capture us, and they're going to take us out of our home, just like you take a fish out of its home when you catch it. He's going to take us out of our home and resettle us in Babylon. That seems to be what he's talking about. And sure enough, this is precisely what happened. They came in, did exactly this. They came in and they conquered Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. And we see all of the same cruelty present in them that we saw with the Assyrians when they laid siege to Jerusalem. They laid siege, meaning they just surrounded it, and they were basically surrounded it for a year. They wouldn't let anybody come in. They wouldn't let anybody go out. They basically starved the people in Jerusalem out. We read in the book of Lamentations this horrific account of the people of Israel, things getting so desperate in Jerusalem that they resorted to cannibalism. And then finally, when the Babylonians did sack Jerusalem, they took the king, Zedekiah, and they took his sons, and they brought his sons before him, and they killed his sons in front of him, and then they stabbed out his eyes, so that the very last thing that he saw was the killing of his sons. You can read this in 2 Kings. So again, Habakkuk, living a generation before this or so, he sees, okay, this is your plan, God? That's how you're going to deal with injustice, is you're going to bring in the Babylonians? This is really a solution? This would be like you call the police to deal with a domestic dispute, and they send a serial killer to deal with it. Okay, you broke up the fight, but things are a little bit worse now. Or you go to the doctor with an illness, and they give you a medicine that makes it worse. You go in with a headache, they give you a pill, and you break out with boils and all kinds of infestations all over your body. Oh, okay, the headache goes away, thank you. But is the solution really any better than the problem? How many of us can resonate with Habakkuk's complaint? How many of us have turned to God in our time of need, prayed, and then the answer that he seems to give almost makes things worse? So perhaps you're having problems at work, challenges with your boss, challenges with your coworkers, just the stress of you. You're like, God, please help me get through this. Free me from this. And so what happens? You get fired. Okay, well, I guess I'm not dealing with those problems anymore. But is the solution really any better? I think we can all resonate with how Habakkuk is feeling. We turn to God, we pray, and the solution seems worse than the problem in the first place. Okay. So how does God respond to Habakkuk? How does God respond to us when we come to him with this kind of complaint? And what I want to suggest is that the next section can really be summarized with one word. And here's the word. Wait. God's answer to us when we turn to him in our time of need and in our time of suffering is often wait. That is the answer to the question of suffering, the theodicy question, right? That question which people often ask, that question that often becomes the question that turns people away from God. Why does God, if he's so good, allow such horrific things to happen in our world and to me? And God's answer, the answer that we get here is wait. I suggest it's that one word that undergirds how God answers in this next section. Here we see it, chapter 2, beginning in verse 4. This is the section that was read at the beginning. And the Lord answered, write the vision. Make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. So what he's saying here is he's telling Habakkuk, he's like, okay, I'm going to give you an answer. I'm going to answer your question. And I want you to write the answer on a tablet. And I want you to write it so big and so clear that anybody can see it. Somebody's running by, they don't even have to stop to look at it. They can read it while they're running. If this was written today, he'd say, put this on a billboard. So big that if somebody's flying at 80 miles an hour down I-25, they don't have to slow down. They can read it. I want this to be really clear, right? So then, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Then most scholars think this last part is what Habakkuk would have actually put on the tablet. Here's what it is. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Okay, now in that verse, what we see here is God drawing a comparison between two types of people. You've got the upright and you've got the one who is not upright, okay, so the unrighteous, in contrast to the righteous. And of course, this kind of comparison, sort of kind of boiling it down to there being two types of people, is pretty common in the scriptures, right? You got the righteous, the unrighteous, you got the sheep, you got the goats, you got the sinners, you got the saints, right? So it's just drawing this comparison between two types of people. And what we see here is that the unrighteous, okay, his soul is puffed up, but the righteous are those who will live by his faith. What he's saying is, I will deliver those who have faith. Okay, well, what does that mean? What does this word faith really mean? I think when we take this word faith and we set it within the context of this passage in Habakkuk, we find something very crucial about faith. And here's what it is. The essence of faith is waiting. Genuine faith is about waiting. You see, faith is not just the kind of faith that we're talking about. Saving faith, it's not just mere belief, like I just believe this. You know, like, well, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, or I'm a theist, I believe in God. Just sort of a mental assent to a certain statement about the reality of God. That's just, okay, that's not what we're talking about here. I'll give you what I mean by this. So I have faith in any tennis fans here. Okay, good. I picked the wrong analogy. Well, I played tennis in high school, so bear with me. And right now we're in the middle of the Wimbledon Championships, which is the biggest tennis tournament each year. And I have faith that Novak Djokovic is going to win Wimbledon this year for the 8th time, tying Roger Federer. I think he's playing right now. Maybe you can tell me. Maybe he lost and whatever. Don't tell me that. But I have faith that he is going to win. But here's the thing. I'm not waiting on that. Like, my life doesn't hang in the balance on whether or not Djokovic wins or not. I believe it's true. I believe he's going to win. But I'm not waiting on that. Now, if I went and, took all of my savings and, went to sportsbetting.com or whatever it is, put all my savings on that. Well, now, wait a minute. Now it's hanging in the balance, right? Now I'm really waiting on this. But to just believe that that's true, that's not genuine faith. It involves this kind of waiting. Now, why? Why is waiting so crucial to faith? Here's why. Because waiting involves trusting God rather than taking control of yourself. And this is what emerges in the next verse, in verse 5. It says, "Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples." Now, truthfully, the first part here says, "Moreover, wine is a traitor." A number of scholars think that's a scribal error, and wine should just be translated as wealth or maybe even removed. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. The key thing I want to highlight here is, notice this. It says, "an arrogant man who is never at rest." See, he's drawing a comparison between the person who trusts in God and then this arrogant man who trusts in himself, right? So if you don't trust in God, now you can start trusting in yourself, which puffs you up. But here's the point. If you have to rely on yourself, you're never at rest because it's all up to you. Right? You're not waiting on God. You're taking control of everything. And so you are never at rest. But waiting for God means relinquishing control. So the essence of faith is waiting. We see that waiting involves trusting God. We can actually do this. I'm going to use a little math equation. Some of you like this here. Okay? Faith plus waiting equals faithfulness. Genuine faith that is about waiting on God then results in faithfulness. And one of the ways in which we know this is true is in this kind of common situation where imagine a woman is engaged to a man who goes off to war. Okay, they're engaged. He goes off to war. He's on deployment. He's gone for 6 months, gone for a year. And he comes back, and she says to him, "I waited for you." Now, we all know what that means. That means I was faithful to you. It means I didn't run around with other men while you were gone. That word waiting carries more than just waiting. It implies faithfulness. And in the same sense, the kind of faith that we're talking about here is faithfulness. Which is why, interestingly enough, the word that is translated as faith in the ESV, in Habakkuk verse 4, the word that is translated as faith, the Hebrew word, the particular form of the Hebrew word, is used in the Old Testament scriptures 7 times. Here, of course, the ESV translated as faith. One other time it's translated totally differently because the context is totally different. But the other 5 times, this same word is translated as faithfulness. In fact, some scholars think this should be translated as faithfulness. The righteous shall live by his faithfulness. Now, I don't know this for sure, but probably one reason why it's translated as the righteous shall live by faith is because this verse in Habakkuk happens to be probably the most famous verse in the book of Habakkuk. It is a verse that is referenced and quoted in the New Testament several times. It's referenced by the Apostle Paul twice in Galatians and in Romans, and he uses it in defense of his doctrine of justification by faith alone. Now, what is clear here is that Paul, when he says faith, he really does mean faithfulness. When Paul says that we're saved by faith, not works, he's not saying that genuine faith is a faith totally divorced from an obedient lifestyle. What he's saying is that it is a faith that is not dependent on your religious performance. That's what he means by works. He says you're not saved because you engage in particular religious practices. In particular, he's talking about the Jewish religious practices of the first century, whether it was circumcision, food laws, following certain religious festivals, purity laws, all of those types of religious activities that gave the people of Israel a unique cultural identity. He's saying that has nothing to do with genuine faith. So faith apart from works. But he doesn't mean that genuine faith isn't a faith that results in faithfulness. Because faith is about waiting. You see, this is hard for Americans, isn't it? Because we do not like to wait. Okay, so we see the nature of faith is waiting. But what is it that we are waiting for? What are we waiting for? Okay, I'm waiting. What am I waiting for? And I want two things emerge here. The first one is obvious, and the second one not so much. But let's look at both of them. What are we waiting for? Okay. We are waiting for deliverance. That's what faith is about, waiting for deliverance. And in fact, the rest of the book of Habakkuk is about the fact that God will deliver. The rest of chapter 2 is yet another taunt song. It's a song that's celebrating the ultimate downfall of Babylon. That yes, God is going to defeat Babylon, and he's going to defeat all injustice. It's kind of actually unclear at times whether or not chapter 2 is talking about the downfall of the Babylonians or just the downfall of the unrighteous in general. Probably because Habakkuk wants both, right? He just wants all of this injustice out of the way. And so it's looking ahead to this time when God will do that. God will bring deliverance. He will deliver them from the Babylonians. He will deliver them from the unrighteous. So this taunt song is very similar to what we saw in Nahum, where it talks about the downfall of the Assyrians. Now it's talking about the Babylonians and the wicked in general. But once again, this point emerges that they have to wait for it. We see this in chapter 3, verse 16. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bone. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. He's saying, I'll wait, and I will trust that God will deliver us. You see, friends, once again, I hope I say this just about every week. The heart of the Christian faith is that God will deliver you from whatever you're going through. Whatever it is, he will deliver you. Whatever you're in, whatever challenges you're facing, work, health challenges, financial challenges, he will deliver you in his time and in his own way. Sometimes we have to go through death first, but that's a small thing to God. The heart of the Christian faith is God will deliver you from whatever it is that you are facing. You know, the Bible actually, really, the entire Bible is an answer to the question of suffering. That's what it is. It is an answer to the question of suffering. Oh my gosh, there's all this suffering in this world. Yeah, well, the answer is God is going to put an end to it. The only thing is, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. So you just need to wait. What are we waiting for? We are waiting for God to bring deliverance. But there's another aspect to this waiting. And it naturally leads from the first. Here's what it is. We are waiting for God's plan to make sense. You see, again, that's Habakkuk's, one of his major complaints is, oh, wait a minute. How does this plan make any sense at all? And the answer is, one day it will make sense. And I think we see this here in verse 14, the last verse that we had read at the beginning. It says, for the earth will be filled, is looking forward to this time when God will come. It says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Look at that. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. He's saying the presence of God, we will know God. God's presence will be so clear, the glory of God, his presence will be so, it'll be everywhere, like waters are on the sea, right? Waters are on the sea pretty much everywhere. It's a way of saying God's presence will be everywhere. We will know the presence of God, but here there's a flip side to this too, right? If you have knowledge of the presence of God, the presence of God leads to God's knowledge. So as we come to know God, we also come to know his knowledge. We come to see things the way that he sees things. There will come a day when God's plan will make sense. We just have to wait for it. I'll never forget a woman by the name of Madeline Ciccarello, who I had the privilege of ministering to. She was in the church that I pastored in New Jersey, and I had the privilege of doing her funeral when she finally passed away. And she was wonderful. When I first came to that church and was kind of new to pastoral ministry, and she kind of helped me to figure it out. Not that I haven't figured it out now, but I learned a lot. I remember going to visit with her one time. She had cancer, and I'd go to visit with her from time to time. And I remember visiting with her. We had tea, and after a little while, she says to me, she goes, "You know, Pastor, you don't have to stay all day." And I realized, oh, okay, pastoral visits, I don't necessarily want you to stay all day. Just come, acknowledge, be there, pray with them, right? So I learned that was a good lesson. So I came back another time. We're hanging out, and then she tells me about a particular time in life when she went through a very dark tragedy. And she tells me the story of when her daughter was killed in a car accident. And it had been like 30 years since this had happened. And she says, "Pastor, when I die, and when I get to glory, the first thing I'm going to say to God is, why did you take my daughter?" Now, when you hear that at first, you might think that sounds kind of a little irreverent. Like that's the first thing you're going to say when you get to glory. But actually what it shows is tremendous faith. Because what it shows is she trusts that there is an answer. It's an answer she can't know now, probably couldn't even understand it, even if it was given to her, but she trusts that it will make sense someday. Friends, in conclusion, what do we do in the face of hardship? Right? That's what the book of Habakkuk is all about. We wait. We wait for God to deliver, and we wait for God to make sense, for it to make sense. One of my favorite seasons in the life of the church is the season of Advent. Because the season of Advent is all about training us to wait. Waiting is such an important part of the faith that we have an entire season of it to help us reflect on this. The season of Advent, leading up to Christmas, it's this season where we relive the story of the people of Israel waiting for the coming of the Messiah, and then in that training us to wait for his second coming. Waiting, trusting, believing that he will come, he will deliver, and that one day it will make sense. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion? Communion is an opportunity for us to train ourselves to wait. It's an opportunity to grow in our faith. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ. They point us to the reality that in Jesus Christ, God has come into this world. He has entered into the darkness of this world. But it also points to his resurrection. When we take the elements, we are reflecting not simply on the cross, but what happened 3 days later. And in his resurrection, that is the basis for our hope that no matter how dark things get, God will bring deliverance. In fact, in Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, his first letter to the church in Corinth, he highlights the importance of how communion points us to that future. Listen to what he says here. He says, "As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Communion points us back to that reality that one day God will come and deliver, and one day it will all make sense.